Are you there? Are we connected?
All stories begin somewhere. In Deltarune's case, the game opens with this strange, surreal sequence of character creation, which ends up leading nowhere at first glance, as we just end up being cast into Chris regardless. So, why is this seemingly frivolous sequence which is far removed from the main gameplay, given the status as Deltarune's opening scene? Answering this key question unlocks the answers to so many of Deltarune's pervasive mysteries. From the true nature of the Roaring Night and Shadow Crystals, to the importance of WD Gaster and Image Friend, while also playing into the internal struggles of our favorite Lightners very well. And it all ties back to one core concept: escapism. However, before we get there, there's some important backstory that needs to be analyzed first. When analyzing or theorizing on what Deltarune holds in its future, it's important to look at the actual story and themes in context to think about what would actually make sense. To look at the story of Deltarune's future, we must look back on its past first. Despite this section being integral to the overall video, if you already seem to have a firm grasp on the backstory in the Light World already, you can skip to the end of this section. I promise I won't be offended. In the Light World, I believe the three main characters are Chris Dreamer, Susie, and Noelle Holiday, but the Dreamer and Holiday families really are the backbone of this history in Hometown, and yes, the town is literally just called Hometown. Susie's family is shrouded in mystery, and she herself only moved into town very recently. Let's take each aforementioned main character one at a time and analyze them, starting with Chris. Chris Dreamer was adopted by Asgore and Toriel, presumably at a very young age. When they were younger, they didn't fully understand how much of an outsider they truly were, being the only human in the entirety of Hometown, and wondered when their horns would grow in like the rest of their family. In response, Toriel gifted them a horned red headband, which Chris treasured. By contrast, Chris's older brother Asriel was the town's golden boy, star-crossed country runner, popular at school, beloved by the entire town. Chris's identity was defined by their relation to their perfect brother. Even during the events of Deltarune, Chris is still overshadowed by Asriel's reputation, which is exemplified in how the town treats them. However, Chris never really harbored any resentment against Asriel for all of this. Two of them were inseparable all throughout childhood. Chris would end up going on lots of adventures in the woods around Hometown with Asriel and their neighbors, the Holiday children, December and Noelle. December Holiday was the older sister of Noelle and Asriel's age. We know she enjoyed wiffle ball, ice skating, playing guitar, and also probably getting stoned. She had a seemingly punk and rebellious vibe, changing the channel to provocative music whenever she was at the Dreamer house, which Chris was forbidden from watching by Toriel. This is a stark contrast to the golden boy Asriel and his many accolades and overall glorification all throughout Hometown. Despite this, Asriel and Des being December's nickname, were incredibly close, possibly even dating, since Des has Asriel's jacket and retainer in her room. Chris would often take advantage of December's little sister, Noelle, and her gullibility to pull pranks on her. Toriel notes that putting bath bombs in the toilet for no apparent reason doesn't exactly seem out of the ordinary for Chris's behavior, and their prankster nature is further displayed when talking to Noelle in Chapter 1. Wait, you're teasing me, aren't you, Chris? Like when you told me Icy was real and eats kids? So Des smacked you with a wiffle pad till you stopped lying. Despite conflicts with Des about tricking Noelle, the four of them would get along, and their friendship seems to be fondly remembered by everyone in town. Noelle enjoyed being scared, furthered by the fact that she fondly remembers staying up with Des to watch horror movies, so she didn't exactly mind Chris's pranks. Other than adventuring in the forest, the four would often go over to the Dreamer household and gather around the TV. Chris played piano, and they were good at it too. Since there was no piano in the Dreamer household, Chris would often go over to the Holiday house to play, strengthening Chris's childhood friendship with Noelle, as they would often end up at her house. However, one day, everything changed. December Holiday disappeared. Nobody knows why or how she did, but the desk-shaped hole in Hometown was felt by everyone. Regardless of the manner of her disappearance, one thing is for sure: Chris was deeply affected by this tragedy. There is a sudden and remarkable change in how Chris acted as a child compared to how they do as of the story's events. Chris, once constantly mischievous, becomes reclusive, barely socializing. Acting incredibly introverted, is viewed by the whole town as a weird, quiet kid. After Asriel left for college, Chris stopped talking to anyone, even Noelle. This is illustrated in Chapter 1, where if Chris interacts with anybody, it is noted as out of the ordinary for their behavior, especially by Noelle. Chris even went to art therapy, but they were unable to make progress, as whatever happened to Des was buried too deep. Their troubled life is also hinted at in their bedroom, a giant, solidified bloodstain on the carpet, and a stark lack of trophies. Compared to Asriel's cross-country achievements and other accolades, Chris seems to do very little outside of just going to school. Des's disappearance didn't only affect Chris, though. As previously stated, Chris and Noelle's really close friendship dissolved shortly thereafter, which was emblematic of the larger falling out between the previously close Dreamers and Holidays. Carol Holiday, Noelle and Des's mother, became absorbed in her work to the point of being a pretty bad mother to Noelle, likely due to December's disappearance. Asgore, chief of police and Chris and Asriel's father, did something wrong to get him fired from his role as police chief at the same time as Dessa's disappearance. Since December's disappearance is like basically the only important thing that happened in the past, and it would be really anticlimactic if it was literally anything else, it's basically unanimously assumed that Asgore's firing as the police chief was because of something to do with how he handled December's disappearance. However, this assumption can be challenged and isn't outright confirmed, but later on there's a lot of evidence that points to it that can't exactly be discussed without building off of other assumptions. Toriel absolutely hated what he did, and this strained their marriage and led to them constantly fighting. Less and less people would show up to the Dreamer household and just watch TV or be happy. First December, then the holidays, then Asriel left for college, then Toriel divorced Asgore and made him move into his Flower King store, until it was just Toriel and Chris living together. Chris, on top of dealing with all the trauma that came with whatever happened to Des, had to deal with their divorcing parents, their brother, and also closest friend Asriel leaving for college, while grappling with their own identity as the only human in town, led them to seclude themselves from everybody. Similarly, Noelle's life was also permanently changed by the tragedy surrounding December holiday. In a room in Chapter 2 built on Noelle's search history, a calendar with the date December 25th on every day is in the room. This probably isn't because of Noelle's obsession with Christmas and the holidays, lowercase. That seems to be more of her parents' thing. It is more likely because she is constantly searching for her sister, December Holiday, to see if there's any sign of her. This idea is bolstered by her blog post, in which she states that she has a habit of checking her spam mail, just to see if anyone reached out to her. Why would Noelle do this, unless there was somebody in particular she's hoping will reach out? Not to mention the song that plays when Noelle is in her room in Chapter 2 is entitled Lost Girl. If you want more evidence that they are related, if you go to deltarune.com/December, it leads you to an error 404 not found type page. However, if you use her nickname at deltarune.com/Des, it leads you to a tab with the flavor text, "It's a red guitar," displaying the same guitar found in her room. If you click it, it plays a distorted version of Lost Girl entitled findher.ogg. After Des disappeared, Carol became a lot harder on Noelle, with her father Rudy being the only one to even it out. However, Rudy fell ill, and by the time of the events in the game, is hospitalized. Noelle's sister disappeared, her best friend Chris withdrew completely from her life, her father fell ill, and her mother is extremely hard on her. And in contrast to Chris's guilt, Noelle feels she has no control over her entire life falling apart. The final thing to talk about previous to Deltarune actually taking place is Susie. As explained in one of Noelle's blog posts, Susie is a new girl who hates Chris. Susie is seen by every kid as a bully. However, she doesn't bully Noelle for reasons Noelle is not aware of. The actual reason why is because Noelle offered Susie a pencil early on when she didn't have one. Susie was never really a mean person. She just puts up an aggressive persona to mask her insecurity and fear of being rejected. She never actually hurt anybody in Hometown. She just looks and acts intimidating enough to scare everyone away. However, Susie seems to have a particular distaste for Chris. The reason why is never explicitly stated, but using the info it is pretty safe to assume. Susie met Toriel early on in her time in Hometown, and along with Noelle, Toriel was the only one to show Susie compassion and not immediately write her off based on the exterior she put out into the world. When Susie bullies Chris, oftentimes she brings up Toriel. In Noelle's blog post, she recollects this story. She ran over and grabbed Chris by the hair, staring into their face, really close. I froze. I knew that if I didn't do anything, Chris would get hurt or worse, but something inside me just froze. I just stood there, holding my breath, and Susie kept talking. One day, your mom's gonna get sick of you, you little freak. And as soon as that happens, Susie laughed. I felt genuinely sick. Someone might make you disappear, and she'll finally realize how happy she was without you. Unrelated note, but Noelle freezing in this case shows how helpless she really feels in the grand scheme of things, and the lack of agency she feels she has, which adds to the character analysis done above. If we look around Hometown, Susie doesn't seem to have a home. She immediately gets attached to Toriel during the sleepover and seems especially disturbed and betrayed at the sight of Toriel drunk in Chapter 4. When Toriel tells Susie to call her parents for the sleepover, she stares at her phone but never actually does anything, meaning that whatever Susie has going on parentally, they don't care if she disappears overnight. Additionally, Susie drinks milk left outside and is constantly hungry, eating everything she can get her hands on, including chalk, which is arguably the inciting incident of the whole game. All this adds together to paint a not-so-great home life for Susie. She sees how compassionate Chris's mother is and resents them for it. That's why Susie hates Chris especially, because she is jealous of Toriel and resents that Chris has such a good mother, while she has not a great parental relationship. Finally, having finished covering a summary of what happened before Deltarune, we can continue to analyze the actual story and the escapism of the Dark Worlds. Any lightner determined enough can create a dark fountain by coursing their will into a blade and stabbing the earth, releasing the darkness below. The exact nature of dark worlds isn't fully explained, but Rousey gives us the clearest explanation in Chapter 3. You see, Susie, you and Chris live in the light world. A place where everything is as you see. That is, as long as there's light. You see, when it gets dark, things become more indistinct. A chair can look like a monster. A poster can look like it's moving. Your eyes can't see the truth anymore. And when the light runs out, you see nothing. Of course, your mind can't make anything of nothing. But what if? What if it became even darker? Darker than dark. The dark worlds are a twisting of reality to bring things to life that aren't truly alive. However, this doesn't mean they are inherently sinister. In fact, these dark worlds have been incredible for all of them. These fun, albeit fictional, adventures have been a distraction for everyone from their greater issues at home, and even helped some characters confront their demons and develop under a new lens. These dark worlds represent a form of escapism, a literal interpretation of the power of fiction. A temporary distraction from the troubles of the outside world. In Castletown, Rousey explicitly states to Chris and Susie that, "I'd be happy if this place could be like a second home to you. A place where you can go, no matter what's happening outside." The Dark Worlds obviously hold more literal significance than just a story within a story, as not only are they real settings the characters can venture into, but arguably more importantly, characters like Rousey, Lancer, Tenna, and Queen are real, developing characters existing in an active setting with pasts of their own. However, in the Light World, they really are just objects lacking any sentience, and most of their baseline personalities are tailored to the Lightners and their inner conflicts, reflections of the issues present in Hometown's population. Even in our analysis of the history earlier, some mentions of Dark World locations were unavoidable, as they reveal parts of the character's past unexplorable in the Light World, the reality to these characters. For example, Chris's art therapy session was revealed in the egg rooms of the Dark Worlds. In chapters 1 and 2, these rooms seem incredibly unimportant, just little Easter eggs which give you eggs when you interact with the man behind the tree in this hidden room. In chapter 3, though, getting to the egg room is much more complicated. The island with the man behind the tree is called Man Country, and it's home to the 7 Flying Aces, cards Chris drew in their childhood to cheat at card games when playing with their family. In chapter 4, you enter a therapy room where one of the same Flying Aces acts as a secretary. This is a full quote, so it might be a bit longer, but when you interact with the easel in the room and make Chris draw what they saw behind the tree, this happens. Chris picked up a pencil. They began by sketching what they had seen behind the tree. But, as they sketched, the line began to ear, as if the pencil had lost its way. So they started again, drawing over the lines they had already made. Many times they would suddenly halt, or the pencil drifted into a new drawing. So they started over again. Through many repetitions, their movements became faster and smoother, until without looking, they had completed a sketch in a single wild line. In the end, as a result of layering the sketches on top of each other, the surface of the canvas was nothing more than a monochrome smear. Next, a tree was painted over it, painted over everything, leaving nothing but a simple still life. After all, there wasn't anything to look at in the room besides a single tree. Chris got up. It seemed the painting was complete. This whole sequence very clearly evokes covering up trauma, and its connection to Noelle's history of discovering secrets is very, very interesting. However, I'd rather analyze this scene later on once we have more ground covered, particularly when analyzing the Eggman in specific. The point is, Dark Worlds and their characters, layout, world, and story reflect whatever the struggles of the Lightners which enter are. A clear correlation to stories and escapism, ways people find meaning or distraction which can reflect their lives and help them work through issues plaguing them. This is also reflected in the settings in which all Dark Worlds take place. Chapter 1 in the abandoned classroom covered in board and role-playing games, toys, and decks of cards. It makes sense that this is the most typical RPG of all the stories, focusing on a fantasy setting in which the villain is a cookie-cutter bad guy. Chapter 2, the computer lab, based around the internet and everything online. Queen's plan of world domination is to blanket the world in happiness and lull them into security, and can live in an escapist fantasy always. The internet kinda is just this. Chapter 3 is the Dreamer household, but more specifically the TV and TV entertainment. This Dark World is a lot more minigame focused, with the games acting as a distraction from all the family discord which also happened in this area. Chapter 4, the Church Dark World, is all about freedom and fighting the prophecy, and the church in Deltarune is basically all about this prophecy and what has to happen. Fate itself. One thing to note is that in the Dark Worlds, the soul has far more power over its surroundings. As revealed in Chapter 4, Chris cannot survive in the Dark World without the soul inside of them, despite being perfectly fine to play the piano and make chocolate milk in the Light World. The soul acts as the party's pool HP, and the overall video gaminess of these Dark Worlds grants the soul significantly more to do than in the Light World, which is fairly dull in gameplay terms. Most importantly, there seems to be no way to steal the Dark Fountains without the light inside our soul. The light inside our soul is not only the only thing bright enough to illuminate Dark Fountains and banish Dark Worlds, but is also bright enough to seal a Titan, a being of pure darkness. Almost as if the Dark Worlds particularly held the soul, and us, in mind, or the light is particularly effective on its darkness. Now, focusing on the characters and how they are reflected and subsequently developed through these Dark Worlds, starting with Chris. Directly after the Gunner Maker sequence, our control as a player is thrust into Chris's body. This should go without saying, as I feel even the most casual of players would understand this by now, but us, as the player, the soul, are not Chris. We are possessing them, robbing them of their agency, and making our choices theirs, albeit inadvertently, and I doubt the player will be explicitly painted as a villainous character outside of the weird route, but just antagonistic to Chris. Jevil, and to a much, much greater degree Spamton, are direct parallels to Chris's situation, and their struggle for freedom and autonomy. However, due to Jevil and Spamton's lore relevance, since they are Shadow Crystal holders, we're gonna hold off on diving into them later. Sadly. I love you, Spamton. Anyway, Chris's other issues, like a lack of self-worth, guilt, and being the weird kid with no companionship, are paralleled and to a certain degree rectified by their adventures in the Dark Worlds. Chris befriends Susie and later grows to appreciate Ralsei as well, despite his eerily similar looks to Chris's brother Azriel and the fact that Ralsei knows much more than he lets on. Even their friendship with Noelle is rekindled in Chapter 2's Dark World. Chris finally has friends. And no, it isn't just because of the player's control, because while we do puppeteer Chris's greater actions, it is displayed time and time again that the little things, the way Chris delivers lines and how they interact with people, is fully up to them. One fantastic scene I would like to highlight is in Chapter 4, when Susie cleans up the bloodstain in Chris's room, something their own mother didn't even do. I feel like this scene sort of speaks for itself, and Chris never would have befriended Susie if it wasn't for the Dark World, a place where Chris could not only make friends, but escape Azriel's shadow. By comparing Chris's bedroom in their own house in the Light World to the one Ralsei made for them, you can see that in the Dark World, they get all the accolades, and finally get to be more than just Azriel's younger sibling. Just look at how badass Chris looks in the Dark World compared to their real outfit. As covered earlier on, Chris obviously feels guilty and yearns for a time before December holiday disappeared. Their nostalgia is perfectly reflected by Tenna, who wants to return to a time when the holidays and dreamers would all gather around him, and he was wanted. The antagonist in Chapter 3 is barely even Tenna himself. It really is just family problems and separation anxiety. Tenna is obviously also hurt by December's disappearance. He basically explicitly says that, even though he has no clue what actually happened to her. Des, rocking to her guitar and singing along with those nasty, nasty songs. Didn't you think she was so cool? Heck, maybe you could even get her to come back and watch again sometime. Also, that one line on the Doom board. Wait, no, not another battle. Please, the family's fighting again. It so perfectly reflects how Chris feels about wanting to return to the good old days, before everything went to shit. And Tenna even parallels Chris feeling overshadowed by Azriel, since Spamton becoming a big shot and the internet as a whole, sort of invalidating TV as a format, makes Tenna feel useless. All in all, Chris's inner struggles are paralleled by the Dark Worlds, from characters like Spamton and Tenna reflecting Chris's struggles with freedom and nostalgia, to the adventure itself helping Chris gain the companionship they previously lacked. In Chapter 2, Noelle also has her own arc about learning to stand up for herself and overcome her meek nature and her idea that nothing she does matters. Noelle stands up to Queen, an obvious stand-in for her mother Carol. Noelle learns, to a certain degree, to be assertive, that her choices matter, and that she can actually change fate and has some degree of agency. This ties back to one of Deltarune's core themes of defying fate and freedom as a concept. concept, but it is also present in Noelle, just as it is in Chris, Rousey, and the story overall. On the other hand, in the weird route, this concept of Noelle gaining agency is horrifically twisted, taking freedom fully away from Chris, erasing compassion from the equation, and focusing solely on Noelle getting stronger and more autonomous. Remaining focused on the main route for now, Noelle gains friendship by learning to go for it and truly talking to Susie for the first time, and beginning to reconnect with Chris as well. Noelle, through the Dark World adventure, learns to accept herself for who she truly is. Gay. Now finally, Susie. Susie is interesting because of her relationship with the core themes of Deltarune. Susie, being the new girl, is strikingly lacking any relevance to the past of Hometown. She doesn't seem bound by the same strings as everyone else. Chris, Noelle, and Rousey are over here constantly struggling against the strings of fate, while Susie breaks them constantly without even trying. Susie resists the soul and our say constantly. She is the only one who stands up to Chris basically ever. She is constantly defying game logic. Susie, simply by existing, has the freedom that so many other characters desperately yearn for. Most of Susie's development comes in Chapter 1, where her bully persona immediately cracks after being validated by Lancer, Rousey, and Chris. The only reason she was so intimidating in the first place was because she was scared of what people would think of her true self. As soon as she realizes she is able to have friends, her true inner nature as this kind, intensely compassionate character who loves her friends is truly revealed. At the climax of Chapter 1, she literally attacks her old self to defend Chris, firmly cementing her as completely changed from her past self. However, her character doesn't remain stagnant after Chapter 1, far from it actually. In Chapter 2, she learns how to heal, showing how she truly does want to be helpful rather than just harmful, and bonds with Rousey. Admittedly, Chapter 2 is Susie's least important chapter, and is more important for characters like Noelle and Chris. In Chapter 3, Susie grapples with her feelings on how she interacts with the Dark Worlds and the characters in them. Even though the Dark Worlds aren't literally real, she still views them as such. Her unabashed shutdown of Rousey's whole identity crisis reflecting how deeply she cares for people. And in Chapter 4, Susie takes solace in finding out she's in the prophecy, or at least that she thinks she is, and that she can finally be a hero. Gersten acts as a mentor to her and further teaches her how valuable she is, and how she can be so much more than that unlovable bully she thought she was in Chapter 1. To sum it all up, Susie's adventures in the Dark Worlds give her friendship, self-esteem, and optimism, none of which she had previously. Despite how prolific the reflection of the Lightners in the Dark Worlds may be, Rousey's struggles with identity and self-worth are also reflected in characters like Tenna and the Dark Worlds themselves. However, since Rousey's struggles largely center around his identity as a Darkner, whose whole baseline personality is defined by what Chris wants to be, his struggles seem to be more emblematic of the introspective nature of the Dark Worlds cast onto the light. Oftentimes, Dark Worlds and Darkners will just completely ignore Rousey and barely acknowledge his existence at all. Queen literally doesn't even bring a cage for him in Chapter 2, and she brings a cage for Birdly. Rousey's struggles being paralleled in the Dark World structure and the Darkners themselves seems to be more a symptom of that his struggles are because of the Darkness's reflective nature, rather than vice versa. The whole point of all of this is to illustrate how Dark Worlds exemplify the reflective parts of escapism, which lead us to become better people. Each of the Lightners have their struggles reflected in these worlds, which lead them to develop and shows the power of escapism when wielded properly. While this sort of character reflection is sorta just good writing, I feel like the way Dark Worlds so perfectly parallel the characters leading to development, while the Light World just remains drab and stagnant, must be important. And this all adds on to the escapism parallel and how Dark Worlds, despite their literal darkness, are not fully sinister. However, darkness isn't all just fun and games either. What happens when you get too lost in your fantasies? What happens when the balance of light and dark is shattered? If too many dark fountains are open, darkness envelops all of the Light World, and unfeeling titans terrorize the Light World. This phenomenon is known as the Roaring. Wherever the roaring comes from isn't just the Dark World itself. When a dark fountain is created in a dark world, a titan emerges from the pure darkness. This is the danger of being overly reliant on escapism and going darker than even the Dark World. How do we know that the roaring and by extension the titans come from a place darker than dark? First of all, the prophecy explicitly states that the roaring happens and the titans are released when the balance of light and dark begins to shift. This ties the roaring and the titans to darkness. We also see a titan come from the dark fountain in a dark world in Chapter 4. Further tying together the roaring and darkness as a concept. This description of the titan given by Rousey is literally, it's the fear of the dark. It's the bump in the night. It's the shadow on the backside of your mind. It has no consciousness. It only exists to destroy. When checking Titan spawn, this text appears as well. A shard of fear appears in places of deep dark. This illustrates that Titans and their spawn are a manifestation of the sinister side of darkness, that universal fear of the unknown which appears in places of deep dark. However, you don't need to create a dark fountain inside a dark world to get darker than dark. In fact, we've already gotten a taste of what the roaring would be like. I've seen it circulating online that Rousey's explanation of how Dark Worlds work disproves the theory that we will go darker than dark, and that Dark Worlds inside of Dark Worlds exist, since he describes Dark Worlds as already being darker than dark themselves. However, that doesn't mean that you can't go darker than dark. This is literally perfectly illustrated throughout all of Chapter 4, not only in the Titan fight when a dark fountain is literally opened in a dark world, but throughout the entire chapter as a whole. This gimmick of using the light inside of your soul to banish the darkness in battle isn't solely reserved for the Titans. In the areas of darkness in Chapter 4, particularly in Jackenstein's fight, darkness, just like the Titan fight, is used. Also, I don't know how this was discovered, but when you go too far into the darkness at the beginning of Chapter 4, the things which attack you and Susie are Titan spawn. This means that the extra darkness where Titans come from doesn't have to just be created, it can also just exist in especially dark places of Dark Worlds. It also expressly proves that things can be darker than Dark Worlds. All throughout Chapter 4, the Fun Gang deals with darkness in one way or another, from fighting Jackenstein, climbing towers to escape rising darkness, running from shards of darkness, and the whole prelude and fight with the Titan itself. All of these seem to be free trials of what the Roaring will be like, a taste of what this super darkness will hold in the future. Why is all this stuff about darkness important? Well, this is going to be a very sharp change in subject, but just bear with me, it'll all make sense in a second. In Undertale, fun events are random events which may or may not happen in any given playthrough of the game, based on random chance. One of them, which creates a grayscale door and waterfall, leads to an empty room containing only a sprite that looks bent and broken out of form. If you notice, it seems like he has holes in his hands. Another fun event leads to the soundcheck room, in which a bunch of unused songs can be played. One of them, Gaster's theme, goes like this. First it goes up by 1/2 step, then 7, then back down 7, and then back down another 1, which repeats over and over again until it transposes itself down another 1/2 step. Additionally, other faded versions of characters in Undertale also appear as fun events, only revealed to certain players, but not others. Some of these faded characters are called Goners, others Gaster followers, but the randomness and monochromatic color palette remain consistent. Each follower says something along the lines of, "The new royal scientist is great, but she could never compare to the old one, Dr. W.D. Gaster. One day, he vanished without a trace, his experiments went wrong, and his life was cut short. They say he created the core. They say he shattered across time and space. Well, I needn't gossip. After all, it's rude to talk about somebody who's listening." These quotes paint a picture of a scientist whose experiments went wrong and disappeared without a trace, leaving little behind to even prove they existed in the first place. Most players will never even hear about Gaster once in their whole playthrough. However, despite what follower number 1's quote may imply, I am highly skeptical that Gaster fell into the core. A molten machine would certainly cut his life short, but the other two paint him to be omnipotent to a certain degree, and what happened to him was far more interesting. If you go into the code of the game, there's a room in the True Lab, the lab of the Royal Scientist, entitled Room_Gaster. This has Entry 17, a block of text written entirely in Wingding's font, with noise playing in the background. When translated, it says, "Entry number 17. Dark. Darker yet darker. The darkness keeps growing. The shadows cutting deeper. Photon readings, negative. This next experiment seems very interesting." Does this remind you of anything? Anything at all? Gaster's experiments obviously had something to do with darkness, in a similar vein to Deltarune's dark fountains. By falling into his own creation, it likely had more to do with being sucked up into darkness rather than falling into the core. With all this established, I think it's easy to set up a set of calling cards for Gaster's involvement in something, or at least some relevance that he may have in this situation. First of all, Gaster's theme is a musical motif showing up anywhere should hint at some sort of Gastery shenanigans going on. Secondly, anything washed out, black and white color scheme, or a monochrome version slightly different than another pre-existing asset or character. This seems to be related to Gaster in some way through the Goners and Gaster followers. Thirdly, anything with visual similarities to the Mystery Man sprite. This may be a coincidence, but I really think Gaster has to be the sprite due to the randomness of its appearance and the stats being 666, commonly associated with Gaster in Undertale, even though the sprite is internally labeled Mystery Man and not literally Gaster. Fourth, and arguably most importantly / directly, anything relating to Entry 17. Wingdings, an all-caps scientific and sliced-up way of speaking, the noise that plays in the background, and of course, any direct quote or reference to what is said in Entry 17. Alright, now that we have that down, let's finally return return to what we started with, Deltarune's opening. First of all, this voice guiding us through the vessel creation process is most certainly Gaster. They speak in the same all-caps, scientific jargony way that Gaster does here. And the track playing in the background of the scene, another hymn, is literally just Gaster's theme, but with a different coat of paint. It's not even hidden, and extremely hard to interpret this as anything but Gaster related. Additionally, the washed out gray vessel we create for ourselves to inhabit is internally titled a goner. Now, this voices Gaster as established, but what the hell is he doing in Deltarune, and where else does he appear? Well, this voice also controls the save slot menu of the game before you beat Chapter 1 in the bare bones version, giving you these Gaster-ass lines when you try to erase save files or make new ones, like, "Truly erase it? Then it will be destroyed. Choose the target for the reflection. It will be subsumed. It conformed to the reflection." What an interesting behavior. He also appears when you die in-game and have the opportunity to give up, and at the end of Chapter 4, where he calls this My Deltarune. Despite being shattered across time and space, Gaster seems to have a ton of control over the Deltarune world, and especially our interaction with it. In fact, the first thing we ever see in Deltarune is Gaster establishing our connection to the world itself. Let's go back to that first line in the Goner Maker sequence. Are you there? Are we connected? Without Gaster establishing our connection, us, the soul, wouldn't even be in the game itself. This inciting incident of the game is literally Gaster summoning us, the player, to inhabit his vessel. We didn't just decide to play this game. Gaster explicitly put us here, for whatever reason. Taking a look at everything Gaster is related to in Deltarune, it seems that he hides in the shadows, and is only related to the darkest parts of the game. Away from the actual gameplay, hidden in the menus, the UI, the diegetic elements. To explain his connections to the aforementioned diegetic elements of Deltarune, and his deep interconnection with how we interact with the game world itself, we must first operate under the assumption that he brought us here. His summoning of us, establishing the connection, must have been directly him. It isn't really a big leap in logic. He literally says that he is establishing a connection between us, the soul, and the world of Deltarune, as the first thing we see in-game. And Toby Fox is not exactly unknown to getting extremely meta with his storytelling. Gaster created a device, which for all intents and purposes is just Deltarune.exe, to allow us as the player to access the world of Deltarune and for our soul to exert control over their world. This conclusion is backed up not only by where Gaster appears, but by the all-caps files. These diegetics elements of the game, like the UI, the introduction, it's all coded in all caps, Gaster's distinct style of type, but also is directly related to how we interact with Deltarune as a world diegetically. Image_depths, one of the all-caps files, is the background of the Goner Maker sequence. Using this information, we can ascertain that the depths is the place where Gaster resides after falling into his own creation, due to his experiments going awry. Image_depths itself is actually a cropped and distorted image of the ocean surface, and with Onion San's dialogue, the literal title of Dark Fountain, along with the general way darkness moves in Deltarune, it's safe to say that the depths and darkness as a concept have some overlap with water and the fluidity of the ocean. Molly Stars in the device theory posits that the device itself acts as a layer of fiction above the light and dark worlds, more real than either of them. Despite this model making the analysis of suspension of disbelief and layers of reality versus fiction much easier to visualize, I propose a more grounded model which literally illustrates what is going on. If you're a lightener like Chris, Susie, or Noelle, you exist on an island of light with no knowledge that you are on an island since you are so far inland. Imagine then discovering the beach, but as you stray further from the center of your island, it becomes harder to see. Things become more indistinct. Your mind can't make sense of what isn't there. You may catch a glimpse of a vast ocean, so much larger than your small island, but also extremely obscured. You might feel waves lap at your feet, but you don't truly see where it's coming from. You can't know what's in the water without going in. But once you're deep enough to truly see what's going on, you can't come back. However, if there was some sort of device to keep you above water, you could traverse this sea without going fully under. You could maybe even discover the other islands of light in the Sea of Darkness. Maybe even a large continent so bright it blinded you. This is how I believe the depths function. Unlike interpretations where the level of reality which Gaster exists are placed above the light world in terms of how fictional they are, this analogy provides an explanation as to how the depths connect us to Deltarune without disregarding the fact that the depths have an obvious connection to darkness and darkness to fiction. I chose this analogy of islands and sea to illustrate how the depths act as a fluid in-between of absolute fiction, separating the real, bright realities such as Undertale or Deltarune, and even our world is the brightest and most real of them all. The dark world plays into this as a buffer of the healthier kind of fiction and escapism. This layer of darkness separates the light world from the depths. If darkness represents fiction and escapism, the depths are that to the extreme, representing this horrific extreme and over-reliance on escapism, and also the most fictitious world of them all. However, this world also connects separate realities. This is why the device Gaster created to get us, the soul involved, is in the depths in the first place. It is a connection between our reality and Deltarune's, which could not have been possible without the fundamental fluidity of the depths. Now that we have established the depths as an actual, physical place of existence where Gaster was lost and discovered the world of Deltarune, we can finally connect it back to the actual, literal plot of the game, and that extra dark darkness we mentioned earlier. If Gaster and his device exist in this sea of absolute fiction, and therefore darkness, of the depths, then this must be the same place in which the Titans exist. The Titans themselves further this interpretation of the depths being unhealthy escapism and absolute darkness, as Rouse literally states that they are a manifestation of the fear of the dark. This same darkness which Gaster must have fallen into, as Gaster having fallen into his experiments which were darker yet darker, is basically confirmed, and it bears striking similarity to how the darkness of the Titans functions. If dark fountains emerge when the barrier between the light and dark worlds are punctured, submerging some of the light into more of that permeating darkness, and Titans appear when the barrier between dark worlds and the depths is punctured, then the roaring is when the darkness of the depths infects, floods, and corrupts all of the light world as well. This also explains why the soul has more power in the dark worlds. The dark worlds, being closer to the depths and where the device is, sort of show the soul having a better reception, which gives it more agency in the dark worlds. It also explains why the light inside our soul is so powerful. Since we as the player come from the brightest reality, the real world, we conceal the dark fountains and even Titans from the depths with our light, as we are the furthest from fiction you can possibly get. Gaster's the first example of a character that fell into the depths, and was affected by the horrible things that happen to you when you go too deep into the darkness. He was shattered and corrupted, as explained by the Gaster followers, who state that his life was cut short, when the escapism becomes too much and you can't come back. However, Gaster isn't the only one in the depths. Let's return to the all-caps files. Their distinct style shows that the device and the files associated with exist on a different layer of reality from the main game world related to Gaster. This means that if a file is in all caps, it must be important to the meta-narrative. A lot of them make intuitive sense. It's like the Goner body and Goner head files, another hymn is the background track of the Goner Maker sequence, the menu files, and all that diegetic stuff. However, there are a few curveballs in here that should be analyzed further to uncover the nature of the depths. Image Friend is a very, very interesting case. However, right now I think the more pertinent file is unused. This all caps file is technically cut content, but I think once you hear it in full you'll understand why it is important. Obviously, it being all caps relates to the depths and Gaster related lore. Here it is. Where am I? Hello? Anyone? Is anybody out there? It's so dark. Someone, anyone, if you can hear me, say something, please. No one can hear me, can they? I guess not. To be honest, I'm not even sure if I can hear myself. What is this place anyway? How did I get here? As if I haven't asked that question a billion times already. I always did have that nightmare. Walking into the darkness with the light shining from the doorway, and the door slammed behind me, and then everything goes black. Is this that nightmare? Or was everything else a dream? I'm starting to lose track of time. Has it been days? Hours? If someone told me it's been years, I might believe them. Before, the sun came up, and so many wonderful things happened that made time meaningful. Things like breakfast or late night TV. In this place, I don't eat or drink anymore. I can't tell if I'm awake or dreaming. I can't even tell if I'm dead or alive. It's just nothing but pitch black silence. Except for the noise. That scratching noise I sometimes hear. This sounds crazy, but even though no one can hear me, when I hear that noise, I feel like someone's listening. Anyone, if you're there, thank you. Somebody else is lost in the depths, and it sure as hell isn't Gaster. Before we get to that, though, let's take a quick side detour to the Roaring Night. This This character is known to have opened the Dark Fountains in chapters 1 and 2, or is at least believed to be responsible in one way or another for their creation. They destroyed Tenna at the end of chapter 3, create a Titan in chapter 4, and are extremely powerful and difficult to defeat. Let's take a look at its design. The holes in the Knight's hands may be a parallel to Gaster, however this may also be coincidental and isn't enough alone to prove anything. The color palette of the Knight is very different from any other Dark World form of a Lightner, bearing little resemblance to any character in the Light World. Even when equipping armor, the identity of any Lightner in a Dark World is still visible in one way or another. The most telling part of the Roaring Knight's design are those antlers. Those antlers single-handedly narrow down any possible candidates to be the Holiday family. I hope I don't need explaining why the Knight obviously cannot be Noelle or Rudy, so then it must be Carol, right? Chris is obviously working with the Knight, this barely needs proving, and Chris is also obviously working with Carol. On paper, it all adds up. Carol is an avid katana fan, intimidating, and has antlers. Who else could it really be? Really though, this whole theory falls apart fast. If Carol was the Knight, we'd have to assume that she first finished chewing out Noelle, then sprinted to the church and subsequently created a dark fountain, all before Chris and Susie arrived. Hey, maybe Carol ran track. No sense writing this whole theory off there. However, if the Knight really is Carol, there needs to be some kind of explanation for 1. Her look in the Dark World, which is eerily similar to the style that the Titans are in, and if you really want to stretch it, the grayscale black and white colors of things Gaster related. 2. Her randomly possessing a baseball bat instead of the katanas she is known for during her introduction, and overall hitting these poses that are more edgy and punk, which really don't fit her personality as we've seen. 3. Her silhouette absolutely not lining up with what we've seen of the Roaring Knight, unlike all the other Lightner's Dark World forms. 4. These supernatural abilities she seems to possess over her own body, which no other Lightners have shown. Her being able to fly, have a morphing orifice on her face which can change at will, and most importantly, her being able to break her own body by periodically violently opening her ribcage, and then returning to normal as if nothing happened. That's actually a very common activity for middle-aged women. If not Carol, then who else could it be? It's Des. But why? In this diagram, there are 3 different central ideas, and I will illustrate how they are truly deeply interconnected, and end up spelling out explicitly what the deal is with this Roaring Knight. What may catch your eye first is this weird shelter thing in the corner. We've talked extensively about December in the Depths, but what's so important about this random place in Hometown? Well, we've already established that Chris was traumatized by whatever happened to Des. The blatant shift in personality and art therapy room being just some examples of this. If we link Chris's trauma to Des as an in-between on the diagram, this will make some things in the future easier to visualize. The first hint that there's some important backstory in that shelter comes from some dialogue in chapter 2. If you head down to the shelter, you see this interaction. You think it's true? You really think there's... what, you chicken? Haha, you got beaks and wings like a chicken? No, just... I ain't afraid, only kids believe that stuff. But Chris... You gonna be a weenie like Chris? Whatever happened in the shelter, it was obviously traumatic to Chris, and the whole town knows about it. We can connect the shelter to Chris's trauma and guilt. However, that doesn't necessarily mean it's an open and shut case. Just because the shelter and December's disappearance both traumatized Chris, doesn't mean that they were necessarily the same thing. One thing we do know, however, is that whatever happened in the shelter has something to do with darkness. In chapter 3, Undyne is taken into the shelter by the Roaring Knight, and we catch a glimpse of the unmistakable darkness effect billowing out of the door. We also know that Team Knight has access to the shelter, as the Roaring Knight brings Undyne into it and Chris opens the door. Or has the door opened for them, it is unclear. At the tail end of chapter 3. It's basically been assumed by the community at large that the shelter acts as a sort of base of operations for whatever conspiracy Chris, Carol, and the Knight are planning. Bottom line, the shelter can be connected to darkness as a concept. Also, the shelter is directly connected to Gaster, as it emits garbage noise. Whether the garbage noise, which is the noise that comes from entry 17, is directly related to Gaster, or more so has to do with the depths as a concept, is yet to be seen, but either way the point remains. The next big piece of evidence comes from the egg room in chapter 4. As covered earlier, the chapter 4 egg room all but spells out the trees covering the forgotten man represent how Chris is blocking out something traumatic in their past. Remember how the children, Azriel, December, Noelle, and Chris would go on adventures throughout the forests of Hometown? Right before we enter the egg room, we get this dialogue, which is all mixed up, but if we rearrange the words, we get this. Lost where the forest would grow, the children followed the pointed tail. The poor children. That bit about the pointed tail is important, but we'll get to it later. First, where the forest would grow? Well, if we look around the shelter in Hometown, it's surrounded by trees, and very, very far removed from the rest of town. If it wasn't there, the forest would definitely grow down there. And who would be lost down there? Maybe one of those poor children who went exploring around the forests of Hometown? The jumbled up nature of this text also reads as a further attempt by Chris to block out what happened in the past. This is why I earlier came to the assumption that Chris promised Carol these things and is working with the Knight because they feel guilt for what may have happened down at the shelter. This quote, in such close relation with the egg room, is what I think all but confirms that the trauma Chris is covering up in art therapy must be what happened at the shelter with December. This lost where the forest would grow solidifies the connective tissue between December's disappearance, Chris's underlying guilt, trauma, and struggle with freedom, and the shelter as a location in hometown. If we also account for the shelter's position of having a dark world and being only open to the Knight and Chris as far as we know, it seems to have an integral role in the story, and is also strongly tied to December's disappearance, if not literally where it happened. Shifting focus away from the shelter, we can real quick discuss Unused, and what it means in context. Tacking it right into the diagram, we can immediately tie a strong connection to the depths, due to its status as an all-caps file. Unused also seems to be describing someone lost in the darkness, so if its capitalization wasn't enough, its content surely does relate it to the depths as a concept. This is technically just Occam's razor, but I feel like it's somewhat fair to tie a tenuous connection between Unused and December, since she is the only lost girl who could fit the bill of someone missing in darkness, besides Gaster, but he talks absolutely nothing like the character present in Unused. Tying December to the depths outside of the tenuous connection Unused presents is fairly simple though, and I feel it strengthens Unused's significance a lot via corroboration. In the gumball machine in Chapter 3, if you input 1225 points into the machine, 1225 being 1225, the date of Christmas, a literal December holiday, Chris is transported to a surreal place with no collision, in which findher.ogg hauntingly permeates the environment. When you interact with the gumball machine found here, this flavor text appears. You used the machine. The capsule came out. Inside was something hard like lacquer. It was a small, dark triangle. You tried to take it, but it slipped through your hand, and you couldn't find it anymore. You couldn't find your hand. With all the surrounding death stuff, 1225, findher.ogg, and all the mentions of not being able to find stuff, one assumption could be made as to what this dark triangle is that it's December's guitar pick, corrupted by the same darkness she's stuck in. Not only this, but the way you enter this room directly parallels the way you enter the egg room in Chapter 4, further drawing comparison between December's disappearance, the egg room, and Chris's repressed guilt. That's all just speculation though. What's important is the darkness of the guitar pick in relation to all the December stuff of the situation. How is this inherently related to the depths? Well, I feel like the triangle being dark and slippery is more than enough by itself, but its parallels to shadow crystals and how they move like water is impossible not to note. It's also pretty safe to assume that whenever some random, dark, unidentifiable yet somewhat eldritch object is introduced, it can be tied to the dark, unidentifiable yet somewhat eldritch depths. Speaking of shadow crystals and their parallel to this dark, slippery triangle, shadow crystals are the last piece of the puzzle to place on this connections diagram before using the Roaring Night to fully solve what these disparate threads really mean. Besides their name being tied to darkness, they are also tied to the wet side of the depths, as a sharp shadow moves like water in the hand, is flavor text concerning these crystals. If you hold a shadow crystal to your eye in the dark world, you see the light world, the place which is actually real, unless you look at a piece of the prophecy in the dark world. One interesting thing to note about the prophecy in Deltarune is that it uses image_depths as the background, which means this absolutely true prophecy must have come from the depths. Additionally, the prophecy being foretold across time and space is mentioned not once but twice. And where else is that mentioned? By the Gaster follower who says he was shattered across space and time. Anyway, if you use the shadow crystal in a room with the prophecy in it, you get this text instead. You held the crystal up to your eye. For some strange reason, no matter how you look, the prophecy's text does not warp in the crystal's lens. I'm not even going to attempt to theorize what happens when you look through the shadow crystals in the light world. However, the fact that they even exist there in the same way is proof enough that they are powerful, supernatural objects which show some form of truth, even if that truth is shrouded in darkness, like the shadows these crystals are. Now, how do you find these shadow crystals? In Chapter 1, if you unlock a door hidden in the basement, you encounter Jevil, the Darkener based off the Jester card. Gestures in a deck of cards are often discarded in the games, and Jevil likely felt somewhat abandoned, since a lot of a Darkener's self-worth is determined by validation from Lightners. At one point, Jevil began to feel like life was just a game, and was driven insane. This situation is explained by the shopkeeper Sham, who says, one day, he met a strange someone, and since then, he began to change. He started saying bizarre things that didn't completely make sense, but didn't completely not make sense either. Soon, he began to see the world as a game, and everyone as its participants. As the court mage and his only companion, I was forced to lock him away. Or rather, lock us all away, in his own words. Since that time, the strange words he said have stuck inside my cotton, and my view of this world has become darker, yet darker. In Chapter 2, you find a Darkner based on spam email named Spamton G. Spamton. He has a similar look to the Addisons, and is later confirmed to originally be an internet advertisement in the form of spam email. His backstory is explained by his fellow Addisons like this. For some reason, his products never seemed to hit, and the Lightners never even looked his way. Poor guy. He started to get a little desperate. I heard he started looking for any way to become more popular. Somehow, he made the right phone call and found someone. Or was he found by someone? They must have been helping him, because suddenly, he was on the phone all the time. Suddenly, he got really good at his job. The clicks started piling up. Even so, he only got more and more successful. He moved into a luxurious room in Queen's Mansion. He started bragging about big TV deals, big cars, big commercials. But then things started to crack. It seemed like whatever was helping him disappeared. His sales dropped to zero, and everything came crashing down. The day he was to be evicted from the Queen's Mansion, I went to his room to check on him, but he wasn't there. There was only a phone hanging off the handle. He must have left in the middle of a conversation, because I could still hear someone on the other end. But when I put the receiver to my ear, there was nothing but garbage noise. As of the events of Deltarune, Spamton is obsessed with getting big, becoming a big shot, reliving his former glory. He wants freedom from the strings constantly controlling his life. He becomes obsessed with the discarded remains of an MS Paint-esque drawing one of the Lightners created of their ideal selves. He prays to it, believing it will somehow grant him the freedom he yearns so desperately for. However, once you upload his consciousness into this body, he remains just a puppet on strings. In a desperate final attempt to defy fate, Spamton betrays Chris, deciding that he needs the light of our soul to truly free him from his strings and let him reach heaven. Spamton is obsessed with becoming a big shot, becoming free, escaping the set path he believes only he can see. To him, the way of breaking free of these chains which shackle him to the ground is by trying to escape his darkness. Obsessing over a Lightner's ideal body, craving the light inside our soul, only engaging with Chris in the first place because Chris is a Lightner, etc. Spamton knows more than he should, just like Jevil. When Spamton finally cuts his strings, he expects to finally be free, but he falls to the ground, unable to move. Spamton cannot survive without these strings he so desperately wants to get rid of. That's why Chris is so scarred by the Spamton Neo encounter. It reflects their experience with the soul, and another person being unable to free themselves from a similar situation to Chris leads Chris to believe that they may just be a heart on a chain their whole life. Let's return to that original story. The mysterious caller who gave Spamton the edge and let him be a big shot by granting him hidden knowledge of the darkness. Who could it be? Shadow Crystal holders already seem to know more than they should, but the identity of this figure who is giving them this knowledge could also be important to know. All we know about them in the context of Chapter 2 is garbage noise. Where else do we hear that description? Oh, right, when you try to call home from inside a dark world. Gerson, also known as the Hammer of Justice when in his armor, is also in possession of a Shadow Crystal. However, unlike the other two, he does not seem to be given too much knowledge and never actually looked inside his Shadow Crystal. Presumably because, unlike Jevil and Spamton, his ashes are deeply treasured by a Lightner, and therefore he doesn't have the same self-worth issues and intense drive, being much more content with his existence. Despite this, he still has relevance to the theme of freedom with his firmly anti-prophecy stance, and does know quite a bit, just not to the same degree as Jevil and especially Spamton. Gerson's explanations of Lord of the Hammer, a fictional book series in the world of Deltarune, directly parallel the events of the story. Dark worlds aren't the only fiction which reflect reality. Gerson also says something else. The story, it became so grand, so overwhelming. Some say it swallowed up the author himself. It's all Gaster, everything's related to Gaster, everything, it's all Gaster. Adding on to the Gaster connections, the community-dubbed freedom motif present in all of the Secret Boss's songs is literally just Gaster's theme. It's like, it's Gaster's theme in a different coat of paint, just like another hymn. All of these parallels to Gaster paint a picture of Shadow Crystals being the object of the depths, crystallized darkness, granting forbidden knowledge of the true nature of reality, driving its holders insane. Since the depths contain the device, all the UI, menus, all of the diegetic stuff which makes Deltarune a video game, and represent absolute fiction, bridging the gap between Deltarune and our more true and therefore bright reality, even just a glance into the depths through these crystals must be shattering to the mind. A brief glimpse of something so beyond the comprehension of characters like Jevil and Spamton that it drives them completely insane. Shadow crystals and their holders are extremely concretely tied to the depths, Gaster, and the meta-narrative. There's no stretching going on there. Now, with all this setup concluded, how does this diagram and connections explain the true nature of the Roaring Night? let's go around to each pinned part of the diagram and see how the Roaring Night is related to it. First, the shelter. We see the Knight enter the shelter at the end of Chapter 3 with Undyne, connecting the Knight directly to the shelter. The Roaring Night also has a direct connection to Chris's trauma, as Chris and Carol's plan to keep Susie from the bunker is obviously related to helping the Knight in one way or another. They are at least somewhat complicit in Undyne's kidnapping, if they're not just straight up accomplices. This connects to Chris's trauma, since the last call we receive in Chapter 4, before Chris proceeds to do whatever chicanery they will do after removing our influence, is, Chris. Don't forget, Chris. You promised. This points to Chris's involvement in this conspiracy not being wholly voluntary, likely being manipulated via the trauma of what happened in the bunker. Connecting the Knight to December Holiday herself is very simple. The antlers obviously mean it must be one of the Holiday family, and as we stated before, it realistically cannot be Noelle, Rudy, or Carol. Besides process of elimination, the prevalence of bat imagery during the Roaring Knight's introduction links the Knight pretty squarely to Des. The bat is firmly her icon. In Chapter 1, Noelle tells a story about Des smacking Chris with a wiffle ball bat. In Chapter 2, Noelle sees a baseball moon at her window and says, "I wish Des could see this." In Chapter 3, the song Raise Up Your Bat is strongly implied to have been written by Des. That quote about Des rocking on her guitar and being a musical prodigy is right before the minigame where we play the song Raise Up Your Bat. In Chapter 4, Des's room contains a wiffle bat. Des is also known to be more punk and edgy, so her vibes as the Roaring Knight seem to be accurate, especially when compared to Carol. The Roaring Knight also has extremely important ties to the depths. Firstly, the holes in her hands are a visual parallel to the Mystery Man sprite. If we connect Gaster to Unused, as they have a very similar story of falling into the depths, we can attribute the random supernatural ability she possesses, and her color palette and style unique to the Lightners we've seen, to her being in a similar position to Gaster. The corruption of the depths, shattering her across time and space in a sort of way, gives an explanation for why she acts nothing like a typical Lightner, yet is also for sure not a Darkner. This corruption of the depths extends beyond parallels to Gaster's story, as her color palette is eerily similar to the darkness-touched beings we've seen in Chapter 4. Some examples of this include those spiky balls that come out of the darkness, the way the Fun Gang is stylized when heading into the deep dark, the rising sea of darkness we climb away from, every obstacle on the crumbling tower in which the Titan emerged from, the Titan spawn, and last but not least to the Titan itself. This style of sprite related to the depths may be an updated version of the grayscale Gastery stuff like Mystery Man and the Goners, but I'll be the first to admit that that's a bit of a stretch. On top of all of that though, the strongest argument for the Roaring Knight being deeply intertwined with the depths and corrupted by darkness has to do with those shadow crystals we spent so long concretely tying to forbidden knowledge and the depths earlier. If you defy the scripted Lost and deal enough damage to the Roaring Knight in Chapter 3, Susie cracks the Knight's blade, and from it comes a shadow crystal. What's important to note here is that the Roaring Knight isn't a secret boss, and isn't really a shadow crystal holder either. She wasn't given a shadow crystal, nor does she have much to do with freedom on the surface. Instead, a shadow crystal comes from her. It's created when Susie chips a piece of her blade, which seems to be made of the same material as her armor. The fact that the Roaring Knight is literally composed of shadow crystals explains why she wasn't a typical shadow crystal holder nor super boss. She isn't just a holder of one, she is the shadow crystal itself, a manifestation of the dark truth of the depths, corrupted nearly beyond recognition. Susie chipping a shadow crystal directly from the Knight illustrates how she isn't just a carrier of the knowledge of the depths, she truly embodies it as a whole. All these connections, these concepts intertwined so closely paint an extremely interesting picture of the true nature of the Roaring Knight. The lost girl, fallen into the depths by the shelter and corrupted by darkness. December Holiday is the Roaring Knight, or at least whatever remains of her physical form. Her consciousness is firmly and unused. However, the degree of which Des actually exists within the Roaring Knight itself isn't exactly clear. Besides that, it isn't fully her, but also a lot of her still exists in it. Depending on how in control December is in this whole situation, this could further parallel Chris's relationship with the soul, and tie into the greater themes of freedom and autonomy in Deltarune, which is partially why I find this interpretation so compelling. No matter what though, if Des is the Roaring Knight who fell into the depths, this explains why Gaster's story is even important in the first place. Grounding the depths and this idea of escapism gone too far, in a character whose disappearance haunts everything in the game and is extremely thematically relevant to the struggles of the characters we actually care about, makes all this crazy metatextual analysis of the depths actually have a character-driven and human core at the center of it. Sorry Gaster, but you don't really have much of a personality yet. I don't doubt Gaster himself will end up being very important by Deltarune's end, just like Flowey from Undertale, but the real reason to care about the depths is for Des. All of this metatextual analysis isn't just to tell an abstract, existential story about layers of fiction. There's an underlying human tragedy at the center of everything in Deltarune, the disappearance of December Holiday. The girl lost where the forest would grow, lost in the darkness. She ties all of the seemingly disparate threads together. From Chris's reluctant conspiracy with Carol to Gaster's menu shenanigans, she's the emotional heart of everything going on behind the scenes. What is the goal of all these characters? The ones driving the plot forward? Why is Deltarune even taking place to start with? So many of the grand questions of the plot become clear when you factor in that the driving force of the game is to find her. These revelations help frame future discussion of the game, and are key context to bear in mind when analyzing any mysteries which don't directly relate to what we've talked about in this video, which is surprisingly few. The depths and escapism as a concept connect directly to almost every mystery in Deltarune. However, there's more we can do with this than just what we've already gone over. Some questions still remain. How did December disappear? How does freedom tie into this, and to what extent will Gaster be literally involved with Deltarune's plot? Who will the final boss be? What's going on in Chapter 5? Who's involved with Chris and Carol's conspiracy, and how? How do all the other all-caps files play into this? Especially Image Friend. There's so many questions still unanswered, but using the depths and escapism as a point of reference makes it a lot easier to solve them. Before diving deeper into the details of Des' disappearance, it's necessary to unpack what role religion has to play in Deltarune as a whole. The prophecy, an obvious religious text, is also extremely important to Deltarune's overall plot, and mentions of heaven and hell are seemingly important as well. The first time hell is mentioned in this game is by Jevo after defeating him, when he says, "Soon the queen returns, and hell's roar bubbles from the depths." There's also a section of the prophecy in Chapter 4 which mentions hell, but that's easier to understand with some more context. More interesting though are the mentions of heaven. In Rousey's original prophecy in Chapter 1, he states that only they can seal the fountains and banish the angels' heaven. In Chapter 2, Spamton mentions heaven quite often. Most of these mentions pertain to his Neo body, and one specific quote really captures the essence overall. After Chris uploads Spamton's consciousness into his Neo body, and during his betrayal, he says this: "This power is freedom. I won't have to be just a puppet anymore." Or so I thought. What are these strings? Why am I not big enough? It's still dark, so dark. Chris. That's right. You. I need you to be big with me. So big we'll stand up tall and see past the dark. Stand up with our heads in the clouds and look into heaven. I just need that little soul you have. This isn't the end of mentions of heaven though. In Chapter 4, the hymn in church before the Dark Worlds open directly mentions heaven. Heaven knows the story that we've borne from our hearts, of the shadows cutting deep, and the heroes that save us. Heaven knows the beauty of the soul, and we weep to the majesty and pray we not forget the tale of Deltarune. Just to complete a comprehensive list, if you put enough money into the fountain to get a revivement, the flavor text says that the heavens were certainly moved to tears by your generosity. Finally, a line in the prophecy of Chapter 4's Dark World mentions heaven. They'll hear the ring of heaven's call. They'll see the tail of hell take crawl. Now, what can we actually ascertain from all this information? Every mention of heaven or hell seems to be tied to absolute truth. Only Shadow Crystals holders like Jevel and Spamton mention it. Or the prophecy, which also comes from the depths, since its background is image depths. Despite what you may assume on a first playthrough, there's absolutely no way heaven just means the light world. Spamton saying that he and Chris must reach heaven makes absolutely no sense based on this interpretation, since he knows Chris is a lightener. Additionally, the prophecy mentioning banishing the angels' heaven is incompatible with the idea that heaven is really just the light world. If it isn't just the light world, then what is heaven? Spamton, a character burdened with forbidden knowledge, strongly feels that Chris's soul will let him reach heaven, unshackling him from the chains which restrain him from truly being free. Heaven must be related to knowledge and truth in some way, but it also can't be the dark depths, since the soul is already established to be a vessel of light. Additionally, since the roaring comes from the depths leaking into the light world, hell's roar coming from the depths must mean that the depths are analogous to hell, not heaven. Also, Gaster's stats in Undertale are labeled as 666, a satanic number, furthering the connection between hell and the depths. Well then, what's the opposite of the absolute darkness of the depths? What is this heavenly light which Spamton so badly wants to watch him and to reach? What does the Shadow Crystal truly illuminate? The angel's heaven is our world, the real world. Think about it. If hell is analogous to the depths, then heaven must be the brightest in opposition to that darkness, right? The most real in opposition to that fiction. Spamton's dialogue about how dark it is and his need to reach heaven's light already paints this picture, but there's even more evidence beyond his words. How can the prophecy both be foretold by the depths and our world? By both hell and heaven. The depths, despite its fictional nature, represent this greater knowledge of the structure of Deltarune's meta-narratives, because they are the connection to our reality, with Gaster and his device acting as the connective tissue. If we operate under the assumption that heaven is our world, then this reframes all dimensions of heaven. Spamton got a taste of the depths, and by extension our world, through his Shadow Crystal, and now yearns for the light inside our soul to liberate him from the darkness. It also recontextualizes the hymn in the church. Yeah, heaven sure does know about the majesty of the soul, and the story born in our hearts. Now, you may be wondering who the angel is if the angel's heaven is our world. Well, as far as I know, angel theories largely fall into one of four camps: Player Angel, Noel Angel, Gaster Angel, or unknown Eldritch Angel. While this interpretation of heaven supports Player Angel theory the most, it isn't incompatible with other angel interpretations. And due to how much contradicting evidence there is on all sides, I'm not comfortable definitively declaring who the angel is yet. What I am comfortable analyzing though is this cryptic line from the prophecy mentioned earlier. The bit about the ring of heaven's call is likely a double entendre. In the normal route, it may just be us guiding Chris. However, ring has been used before to have a double meaning, and maybe in the case of the weird route, our call is that strange voice which Noel hears. Our voice, telling her to cast Snowgrave and use the ring of thorns to get stronger. The image of this prophecy further backs this up, depicting hands holding a literal ring. Even though I don't get much into weird route shenanigans in this video, this puts a large dent in the common fan theory that the weird route is going off the track of the prophecy, as this is basically a direct reference to it in the prophecy itself. An alternate interpretation is this ring may be referencing Spamton literally hearing a ringtone from being called by the people who made him aware of heaven. However, I find this to be significantly less likely, especially because of the prophecy's depiction. Or this is an alternate explanation if you're really committed to the idea of Snowgrave defying the prophecy, but I lean more towards the first interpretation. However, the second line about the tale of Tell taking crawl is very, very interesting. If we assume hell is the depths, then this line is obviously referring to some sort of tale from the depths, distinct from the tale from the depths, with an E, which is very likely the prophecy. There's another mention of a tale in chapter 4. The philosopher says this: the tale which must be followed, the tale which must not be followed. This references the tale of Deltarune, the prophecy, which must be followed, and some sort of a tale which should not be followed. Does this remind you of anything? Who else followed a tale, a pointed tale? A pointed tale, like the tale of the devil from hell, lost where the forest would grow. The children followed the pointed tale. The children didn't just stumble across the shelter, they were led there by the tale of hell. But what entity from the depths has a tail? Definitely not Gaster, and December might have a tail, but not only is she already the Roaring Knight, and is definitely tailless there, this would call into question the entire meaning of Des' disappearance in the first place. Des can't lead Des to the shelter. That doesn't make sense. I think it's finally time we talk about the other all-caps file, Image Friend. Image Friend is a sprite with wide open pink and gold eyes like Spamton's glasses and a wide grin. As of the release of Chapter 2, it only appeared once, as a hallucination in the basement of Queen's Mansion where you upload Spamton's consciousness into his Neo body. The song playing in the background is called Digital Roots. The only reason Friend gathered any notoriety in the fandom at all is due to his status as an all-caps file, but due to how unimportant he seemed in the grand scheme of things, his existence was largely written off. However, Image Friend appeared again in the Spamton sweepstakes. If you click on a chair repeatedly in one of the hidden tabs, you get jump scared by this friend. The meaning of this chair was exposed in Chapter 3, when Rousey explains how dark worlds work and used this chair as an example of the effects darkness has on objects. In this cutscene, Image Friend shows up again, on a strange version of Endogyny. The other place Image Friend appears in is in the Aram boss fight in Chapter 3, where lots of little friends pop up in his attacks. He also appears in some rooms in Chapter 3's Sword Route, and in the darkest areas of Chapter 4. During this route, a song titled Bit Roots plays in the background. The darkness below Queen's Mansion is incredibly close to the Neo body holding a shadow crystal, and the appearance in Rousey's explanation of darkness as well as in the Aram fight and in the Chapter 3 Sword Route all hint at Friend's connection to the darkness, the depths, and therefore hell, along with the capitalization of its file name. However, the most important Image Friend sighting came directly prior to the release of Chapters 3 and 4. In Noelle Holiday's blog, there's a story about a secret egg she discovered in one of her games, Cat Petters. This story is accessible at deltarune.com/egg. Besides being another one of the many stories of Noelle discovering obscure secrets and glitches in games she likes, this one in particular stood out as it was literally about an egg, and the egg rooms in Deltarune so far have been related to Chris's trauma and Des' disappearance. This led many to theorize that Noelle's ability to break games would be what would need to be harnessed to find Des. That's where the story ended. That is until May 2025, about a month before Deltarune Chapters 3 and 4 would officially release. A new hyperlink was added to the blog post, bringing you to deltarune.com/rain, a story which describes Noelle playing the minigames in Cat Petters, one of which being called Jongler. In this minigame, you would collect different rarities of cats to give you points. There's a link in there too, which leads to a minigame at deltarune.com/rarecats, where you play through this minigame Noelle explained earlier. There are two options to continue. If you get rarecat.006, 007, or 008, these are very rare angel cats, which will open a window which leads to deltarune.com/windows. From here, the website pages mirror the process of getting the egg in Deltarune Chapter 4. If you click the correct window, it leads you to deltarune.com/lost where the forest would grow, which leads to an image of a tree. In the actual game, this tree is in the prophecy with the subtitle, Roots. Clicking this tree leads you to deltarune.com/window, and if you click the right link here, it redirects you to deltarune.com/thepoorchildren. Here, you draw until a red tree, like the one with the Eggman behind it, appears, and then once clicked, you return to Deltarune.com/egg. This is obviously directly analogous to the way you get the egg in Chapter 4. So what new information is presented in this website version? Besides solidifying the connections between Lost Where the Forest Would Grow, the egg, and Chris's trauma, it also concretely ties Noelle's glitch hunting and Easter egg discovery to the eggs and to Dess's disappearance by substitution. There's one thing I forgot to mention though, the second strange thing which happens on Deltarune.com/rarecats. In her blog post, Noelle describes an interesting story which happened on this minigame. One time, I remember getting a cat and it actually lowered how many points I had. And then of course I died immediately, so I couldn't get a picture or anything. And of course no one else has ever seemed to find this. Actually, I get the feeling that someone else I know has seen it, but I know that even if I asked them, I probably wouldn't get a straight answer. Ugh. You can actually find this cat on the website, and then again in the actual Cat Petters minigame found in Mike's room in Castletown, one of which being called Jongler actually. If you play both games enough, you may find a cat which is internally labeled as rarecat.009 on the Deltarune.com website. What does this cat look like? Well... The second part, about someone else she knows having seen it, paints a very interesting picture of Chris and their trauma in relation to Image Friend, if the direct relation to Eggman wasn't enough somehow. However, Image Friend analysis almost certainly answers the question of what the Tale of Hell is. Friend is a cat, that much is certain, as they are literally called rarecat.009. Friend is also from the depths, judging by their status as one of the few all-caps files in the game, along with their appearances in the explanation of Dark Worlds in Chapter 3, and all of the darkness related to their appearances. Friend, in their status as a very, very rare cat, also directly links them to the Eggman, because of the Spamton Sweepstakes Rare Cats game, and just being another Easter egg themselves. Additionally, their connection to roots is very, very interesting, appearing in close relation to both digital roots and bit roots, and then the egg room, like the concept of a tree maybe, one used to paint over everything. Friend is largely tied to this concept of roots, and we can bear this in mind when exploring future chapters. Considering all of this, I think it is extremely fair to assume that the Tale of Hell in the prophecy, and therefore the pointed tale which led the children to the shelter, is Image Friends. Everything lines up so perfectly. Their relation to Chris's trauma via the egg room and therefore Dess's disappearance, their status as a being from the depths, and literally being a cat with a tail in hell. Just like the devil, the children followed the pointed tail, the pull of the darkness, which led Des to become lost where the forest would grow. The devil analogies basically write themselves here. Friend guided December into the darkness, somehow. If Image Friend is the reason December was lost, ties into Noelle's knack for discovering game secrets, and by extension the weird root, is also related to the egg rooms, and therefore fundamentally tied to Chris's trauma, guilt, and the depths, expansion on the role it plays may be the final missing puzzle piece in understanding Deltarune. So, does looking at Deltarune with this overall lens shed any light on what the future holds? Well, yes. Deltarune Chapter 5 is all but confirmed to take place in Asgore's flower shop, Flower King, and this presents some very interesting avenues that the story could go down. Not only does a prophecy depicting Asgore state the Flower Man trapped in asylum, but when Gerson describes Lord of the Hammer's chapters, obviously paralleling Deltarune's, he says, Chapter 5, the Field of Pink and Gold. The vast garden is charred in an inferno of jealousy. If you remember from much earlier on, Asgore also feels guilty for whatever happened with Des. Whatever Asgore did got him fired as police chief, and divorced him from his wife, and he's been trying to make it right ever since. If you interact with the side of Asgore's Flower King, this flavor text appears. The back door is blocked. You can only see through the basement window. A corkboard is covered with tons of papers, and documents litter the floor. Asgore's obsession with making right on what happened and finding Des is further illustrated in the Holiday House segment, where if you eavesdrop on him, you can hear him talking to himself. We're almost there, aren't we, old friend? This time for sure, Tori will finally see what really happened, that I just wanted to protect everyone. And this time, she'll have to believe me. They all will. Then, we'll all be a happy family again, won't we? It sure is beautiful, isn't it? This black shard. Asgore, more than any other character without a spotlight thus far, seems extremely important to Deltarune thematically and narratively. He's been put on an unprecedented pedestal in comparison to his role in the first two chapters. His desire to return to the past, his relationship to what happened with December, his obsession with Des leading him to neglecting his own business, and now his possession of a black shard. The black shard Asgore has is absolutely baffling to me. I don't know if it's a shadow crystal, maybe something like Des's guitar pick, or some new dark item. The other mention of a black shard comes from Chapter 3's fight with the Roaring Knight. When you chip off the shadow crystal, a black shard comes too. Regardless of the semantics of what this black shard literally is, it spells out in no uncertain terms. Asgore is trying to find Des, and he's making progress. This fact not only basically confirms the extremely popular theory that the tragedy of December Holiday was directly related to Asgore's firing as a police chief, divorce, and subsequent obsession with making his past mistakes right, but also all of these facts together lead me to believe that Chapter 5 will be very, very interesting. A Flower King Dark World isn't one you would immediately think of when hints to December Holiday are being talked about, but Asgore's entire basement is littered with papers and a literal conspiracy board on his wall dedicated entirely to finding Des. Additionally, if you recall, each chapter's Dark World reflected some form of escapism. Chapter 1 was cards and board games, Chapter 2 was the internet, Chapter 3 was TV, and Chapter 4 was religion, primarily. What kind of escapism is present in Flowers? Well, I believe Chapter 5 will center around escapism through obsession, Asgore's obsession with finding Des. If that isn't enough of an actual visual theme, like how the other forms of escapism were represented in their respective Dark Worlds, I propose it could be similar to Chapter 4, where music and literature both played supporting roles as forms of escapism to complement the core religious theme. Chapter 5 may have some comic books or superhero elements taken from the comics in Asgore's room, and also use gardening and plants as a theme since many people use gardening as a form of escapism as well, while a core thematic and narrative focused is placed on his obsession with finding Des. I imagine Chapter 5 opens with the festival, a more lighthearted, fun break from the Dark Worlds, until Asgore sees Toriel and Sans together and realizes that despite his efforts, it's too late to bring back his happy, idealized family. Or maybe he thinks that he needs to work faster before it's too late. Maybe his studies into what happened lead him to figure out how to make a dark fountain, and in a last-ditch effort, he creates one himself. However, this is all just speculation for the most part. I also put a 50-50 on if Noelle comes with us to the Flower King Dark World. I really hope she does since I've missed her since Chapter 2. She seems to be a very important character, and it would make sense for her to be in the chapter where Des' disappearance is the most central. But her not appearing in Chapter 4's Dark World makes me question how often she'll actually appear in-game. However, one thing pointing to Noelle's involvement in Chapter 5 being very important is found in the code, where she has dialogue for every item as if she is a party member, despite never appearing in the party since Chapter 2. This may just be to give Noelle more character, as dialogue from the Chapter 2 era exists for items she can't possibly have. But since Chapter 5 was originally said to be released alongside 3 and 4, this points to a high likelihood of her reprising her role as a party member in Asgore's Flower King Dark World. One thing is basically certain though, Chapter 5's Dark World will end up in Flower King and puts more of a spotlight on Asgore and December Holiday's disappearance. This would be interesting thematically and tie in a new Lightner who is extremely intertwined in the overall narrative. I know people were really excited for Toriel in Chapter 3 and then she kinda just ended up sleeping through the whole thing, but Asgore being labeled as Boss 3 internally in the prophecy alongside Queen Antenna as Bosses 1 and 2 basically confirms he'll have a far greater role in Chapter 5 than Toriel in 3. Going on this interpretation, the future chapters must have some sort of important thematic relevance. As stated earlier, I imagine Friend and possibly even Gaster's role will be expanded upon greatly, since there is so much setup and connections, but not a whole lot of actual content yet. Especially since we're coming up on the end of the game, there just simply isn't time to spend a full chapter in Icy's Pizzeria or whatever, considering we only have 2 chapters to fill, besides Chapter 5, which we already went over. If I had to put in one guess only, I'd say Chapter 6 is in the Shelter and Chapter 7 is the Roaring. However, Chapter 4 abolished the formulaic nature of Deltarune chapters completely, leading me to believe there's a high possibility that more than one Dark World can appear per chapter. There's a few extras which could be thrown in. A Dark World in the Holiday House would be goddamn awesome, and one in the hospital would make narrative sense as a last-ditch attempt to save Rudy. However, I doubt there would be much to actually do in there since the hospital is so small, and doesn't have much to offer beyond the surface level saving Rudy's life stuff. None of the other places in town, besides maybe Town Hall, have any relevance or any chance of actually housing a Dark World. The diner, Sans' store, the apartments, the police station, none of them have nearly enough stuff going on to even be possible. So, if Chapter 6 and 7 end up being more complex than just one Dark World per chapter, or the Roaring, I'd put my money on the Holiday House and or the hospital. Most importantly though, I believe the reason why the Roaring will probably happen in Chapter 7 is because Chris and Carol's plan to save Des goes awry. Maybe Rudy dies and Noelle tips the balance of light and dark by making a hospital Dark World, or something else happens altogether. But the core conflict likely stems from this group effort to save the lost girl, and it going wrong. All the endgame stuff will probably happen. We have to fight Chris at some point, especially in the Weird Route. It would be such a missed opportunity otherwise. It's impossible not to capitalize on it. Final thoughts before this video wraps up. For one, fate is probably represented by the depths and darkness as well. Spamton mentions darkness as the thing pulling the strings, the only way to fight the Roaring Knight is by defying a scripted loss, and the prophecy itself uses image depths as a background, etc. Gaster is likely trying to defy this fate as he brings the light inside our soul to the world of Deltarune, and tries to create a vessel for us before we were forced into Chris by whoever the second voice is. I might go more into depth, onto the role Freedom has to play in all this in a hypothetical second video, as it seems very important, but I haven't fully mentally unpacked it yet. I didn't go too much into how Chris and Carol's conspiracy actually works. A lot of this isn't me literally suggesting what happened or what will happen, and more so the broader strokes of the narrative. I don't know how directly involved Asgore and possibly even Alvin is with the plan, or even exactly what they're trying to do besides some vague rescue December through darkness stuff. The roaring could have very easily happened by now, and besides Gaster bringing the soul into the world, I don't know what made Chris and Carol decide to act now of all times. The literal logistics will probably be revealed later, but I'm fairly confident I have the overall concept pretty down. In the end, Deltarune is, at its core, a story about fate, freedom, fiction, and escapism. By looking at the story through this thematic lens, it's possible to piece together the full story of December's disappearance and where this will take us in the future. I don't know exactly how chapters 5, 6, and 7 will go, but I do wholeheartedly believe this. It's all gonna come back to finding December Holiday, rescuing her from the darkness we've been venturing throughout the whole game, the darkness which reflects in all of us. From Noelle's helplessness and inability to change her surroundings, Susie's struggle with self-worth and ability to be her genuine self, all the way to Chris's festering guilt and the way they grapple with their own lack of freedom and identity. All the inner turmoil of these characters is reflected in Escapism, how they interact and are molded by the darkness they enter. Rescuing December from the depths of hell isn't just for no reason. It parallels the core struggle and thematics of Deltarune's characters, just as the Dark Worlds have, but to the extreme. But how do they know once they've gone too far, and end up just as lost as December Holiday herself? We're finally done. I hope you enjoyed my video and analysis of Deltarune. I might make a follow-up video depending on how well this does, but besides that, I have a few things to say before this video is fully wrapped up. I'm sorry if a lot of the ideas presented in this video the community has already dissected. This video took an incredibly long time to create, and when I came up with most of these ideas, especially the friend connections, I hadn't seen it discussed anywhere else yet. Hopefully this video still has something to offer though. This theory has a lot of similarities to Molly Stars' device theory, which I explicitly reference at some point when describing the depths. The analysis done there of the meta-narrative is just so incredible it's hard not to have some overlap, and I strongly recommend checking it out if you have 10 hours to spare. A few more assorted recommendations for other content I find good and relevant to the video. Literally any of Andrew Cunningham's Deltarune videos, they're all great, but I especially enjoy the one about Gaster's theme. This Gaster video by Misty Sparkles, that one's really good. All of the Nighthawk video essays about the Deltarune characters, DarylTalksGames video about Noelle, and this video compiling everything about Des by HalfBreadChaos. Outdated because of chapter 3 and 4, but still a very worthwhile watch. I'll link all of them in the description if you somehow watch this video and haven't seen any of them. I don't imagine this video will get seen by many casuals, but just in case, these are some more high quality Deltarune content if you want to fall further down the rabbit hole. Make sure to tell me in the comments what you think, your take on my analysis or whatever, and I'll respond. I'm so excited to see what Tricky Tony has in store for us in the future of Deltarune.